So we just want to thank Drew for being here, and students from sports management, students from the leadership practicum, and invited guests and faculty are here as well, just to hear from Drew. I have a few question prompts to get us started, and then we're going to open up the chat to questions from our students, from our staff, and just to get to know a little bit more about you and your experience, Drew. So first of all, welcome, and thank you for being back as part of the UNF family. You were actually on our campus 2 years ago, and since then you've had a huge part in terms of the success of our work. Now using your book as our textbook, and you've been able to join our classes the last 2 semesters via Skype or video conferencing. So Drew, just welcome, and thanks everyone for your flexibility, and looking forward to today. So Drew, welcome.
Thank you, my friend. I really appreciate it. It was such a great experience to be down at UNF, especially considering what I went down there for wasn't a class. It was actually a celebration of how your campus engages with the community. And that was such a cool, amazing vibe. I forget the name of the coach who blew the doors off that day as well. But it was one of the most,
yes.
Yeah, it was one of the most rewarding things I've ever gotten the chance to do. So I appreciate it. You know, I don't have a ton to say off the top. What I love doing is answering questions, because ultimately people ask me things to which I don't have an answer, which then leads to me putting 5 minutes into a future speech. Because the interesting thing about the people who ask the questions is usually you don't get my best answer. I'll just openly admit that, because what happens is after we get off the Zoom call, I sit there and I think to myself, that wasn't a good enough answer. And all of a sudden I work really hard to come up with an even better one. And then the rest of the world gets to benefit from what you asked. So I appreciate that. For anyone who didn't hear it, I do apologize again, because I engaged with that person there. I am not feeling well. I do believe I have the flu. I know everyone is worried whenever but I have been doing a differential, and I'm pretty sure my symptoms are the flu rather than the worst case scenario. But if I'm not bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, I do apologize to everybody. But as I was saying, one of the things that I think is really hard to do when you do this regularly is that you get even harder on yourself when you put out like a handbook on the type of person you want to be. It's actually really tough on you when you acknowledge that you were less than it. And that's one of the problems I found over the last couple of years, is that not only do I try to live up to my standards, I try to live up to the standards that I think other people now have. And I think that that's a dangerous thing to do sometimes, because one of the things that I've learned through a number of different experiences is that it's actually not so much your emotions that really hit you sometimes. It's how you judge yourself for having your emotions, like for which emotions you have. And that not only, I think, goes, and that sort of, I realized that, and not to get dark off the top, but when, if you've read the book, most of you know that it's dedicated to someone named Anastasia, who I lost 3 years ago. And one of the things in the aftermath of that, especially since she died by suicide, is that there's a mix of emotions that come out of that. Grief is awful as it is, although, but when that particular type of death, there's a mix of emotions that come from it. There's grief, and then there's anger, and then there's guilt that all mixes up. And one of the things I realized coming through that process is that it's not the emotions that you're feeling, it's that you judge yourself for it. Like, you find yourself laughing 3 days later because your friends are working so hard to make you feel better. A wonderful act of leadership, because I don't know if anybody feels more awkward than best friends of someone who's just lost someone, because you want to help, but at the same time you feel as if, anything you say might be the wrong thing. Well, what you really need to know is simply being there is all you need to do. But what happens is you find yourself laughing 2 days later, and then immediately you're like, I'm a horrible person because I just had a moment of happiness. Or you're angry at what's happened in your life, and then all of a sudden you're angry because you're not supposed to be angry. So I honestly think that one of the things that I've tried to do is do a better job embracing the fact that you're allowed to feel like you are, and then not to pile on negative emotions by then judging yourself for having them. Although I am in the midst of doing that as we as we speak. So for what that's worth, I think it's important to throw that out there to people. As a leader, especially for one who's trying to be really good, you are very hard on yourself when you let that gap form between who you want to be and how you're actually behaving. And and that's just going to make you less likely to put it behind you and then move on and try to be better in the next moment. So that's a nice happy start to things, Ed. Let me talk about my girlfriend who is gone. But I've often found that talking about things, you never know who else out there is battling with the same type of things.
Sure. And Drew, thank you for kicking us off with that. And it's not, one direction or another, happy or a different direction. It's real. So I appreciate your honesty. So I will kick off with a question, and then we have a few questions from students that want to hear from you. So my first, actually I have two questions for you. My second one was actually stolen by one of our great students.
Benchmarked by one of your students.
Benchmarked. I love it. So my question for you, and the work that I do is so much around finding joy in your work and moving away from what isn't working to what is. Drew, in terms of your work, what brings you the most joy in your speaking and your writing? And what brings you the most joy in the work that you do?
Well, that's such a good question. And it's so weird that no one's ever asked me that before. And it's interesting because we'll often focus a lot on what brings us pain. And we don't spend a lot of time being like, what brings you joy? As I talk about in the book, when you ask people what's the happiest moment in your life, it's not something we've often reflected on, although I don't ask that anymore because as I talk about it in the book, I was steered away from that. I think what brings me the most joy, and joy is such a big, powerful word. And I think maybe the seeking of joy is something that sets us up for a little bit of disappointment, because let's face it, the world is not filled with a ton of like joyful moments, that kind of superlative. The world is filled with a whole bunch of wildly satisfying moments. And I think that if maybe we're searching for that moment that just blows us away, like the first time you see the Grand Canyon, I think that maybe what happens is we miss these really satisfying moments. But I'll tell you, from the moment I walk on stage to the moment I walk off stage is when I feel most like I matter. And for me, I think that there is a moment of wild satisfaction and joy when you feel as if you matter. And when you have the opportunity to do well at what you've worked really hard at, I think is the key. So for me, I work so hard to make sure that 45 minutes, that hour that you get people's attention is as the best version of me I possibly can. So I guess the simple answer is when I get to be what I feel is the simple best version of me, that makes me as satisfied and happy as you possibly can. And for me, that's speaking, because I put so much effort into that and so much work into that. But for anybody who's listening here, maybe it's art, maybe it's your sport or your team. But I think that when you have the opportunity to engage in the thing that you've worked hardest at, the thing that you honestly feel is when you are at your best, even when you're not performing at the very top of that level that you can, like you go out there and you play and it's not quite all the way there that day, but you are still doing the thing that you have worked hardest at, whether it's being in front of a classroom, being in front of a crowd, being on a field, serving young people as a mentor or as a tutor. I think that is what really brings me joy. And also in a moment of satisfaction, I get a lot of little notes from people, LinkedIn, Facebook, through Twitter, where they say, I'm sure you have this happen a lot, but I just wanted to let you know that this book or this speech or this video had an impact. And I just want to tell everybody out there, if there's an author, if there's a speaker that has impacted you, send that note, because there aren't actually that many that come through. But I do talk to people like, oh, I wanted to send you an email. I wanted to do this. Send it. Like if Stephen King changed your life, send Stephen King a note. We do read them. And honestly, sometimes it takes 3 months to send a reply just because there's so much going on. But that brings me incredible satisfaction. And yet everybody diminishes their moment of doing it. But I'm sure you hear this all the time. Well, honestly, if someone showed up every morning and was like, you are awesome, as you walked out the door, At what point are you just like, yeah, no, stop doing that. I don't care. So that brings me a lot of joy to be able to do what I do every day or most days when it's the thing that I've worked hardest at.
Excellent. Now, Drew, I love that, and especially with the idea of the different roles that you're playing. So it's not just speaking. And one of the nice things, and I hope you don't mind, the students that have shared with me how the book or the online resources or even just the TED Talk have been transformational. I've asked them to reach out to you sometime through social media. So I hope you don't mind that, but I
Love it.
know I bombard you with all these positive stories of how the book, how the resources, even that very foundational mindset of being a leader every day has really changed the way not only our students act on campus, but how we teach our program here at the Leadership Institute. So Drew, thank you. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to open it up to some of the questions that folks have asked in the chat box. Drew, can you see those questions in the chat?
They pop up very briefly. Let me see if I can open up the chat box. There we go. Oh, there we go. Yes, but now I can't see you. So if you don't mind, like asking them to me or the ones that you would like to choose,
Sure.
just so that I can still look in and see people.
Good. So, all right, Drew, first question is from Giles. What advice techniques would you give to an emerging leader about to graduate during a global pandemic?
I think that one, emerging is an interesting word. Future leaders has always bothered me. And whenever I talk to somebody who's got like a futures leaders program, I'm just like, if you don't mind, or leadership training, because I think training is what you do to a pet. Like you put a milk bone on their nose and you say, don't eat it till I tell you. And I think that people are more complicated than training. I think that you could develop people, but I don't think it's training. Emerging is a really cool one, but I would once again mention that you're not emerging, you are leading right now. And this idea that leadership is sort of divided the same way that sports are, which is, you've got the major leagues, and then you've got the sort of minor leagues where you're working your way up, A, AA, AAA, and maybe college is AAA, or the C-suite is the major leagues, whatever it might be. We are all leaders now. The one thing about the global pandemic, and I was asking someone else this, in terms of impacting other people, what exactly is it that we can't do now that we could do before? Because the sophistication of our virtual connections, I think, are so powerful now that the opportunity to still recognize people and to still support people is as prevalent, or even perhaps more, when we're going through all of this right now. And I think that one of the things that this gives us the opportunity to do is maybe reflect a little more on how to articulate to other people why they have impacted us. Because I've found that the emails are longer now, that the moments of recognition on social media, one of the things I've really enjoyed is a friend of mine is going back through all of their photos. And maybe this seems like a nothing. Like maybe your question is, how can we change the world more now that we're all, like, face it, the whole world is facing this now. And so the urge to maybe find a way to do the things you were doing before, I know is strong, but nobody can. So instead of sort of saying, we can no longer do these things I had planned to impact the world now, we can shift and say, okay, well, there's a whole new set that I have to think about here. But a friend of mine is going back through their photos of, they pick a different friend every couple of days. They go back through all of their photos, find that friend, and do a post without telling the friend about what they have meant to them, what they have taught them. And this gives us an opportunity, I think, a little bit more to take the things that used to distract us when we could leave our houses and replace it with time for reflection on the different people in our lives. And he says he never even knows what some mornings, which person he's going to do. He just starts flipping back through his photos and he picks someone. And then he goes and looks for them everywhere else. And he starts to reflect on sort of this is your life. He reflects on the first time he ever met them. He reflects on the first time he knew they were going to be friends. He reflects on the moment or what he thinks that person has taught them the most. He talks about the role of that person in the darkest time. Like what was their, when was that person there for them when they needed them the most? So for me, maybe that answer, it's always about how can you impact a single individual other person. But that's what I think we have the opportunity to do now, is stop and, hey, you know, I had an incredible day 2 days ago by just going back to the very first photo in my phone and slowly scrolling through it all and taking a moment like I hadn't done in years to reflect on how kick-ass my life is. And take a time to do that. And then you'll notice as you go through it, who are those people standing next to you in those moments? And then tell them that, because we probably will never take the time again to sit down and type.
Wow.
Not that much.
I love it.
Because you're not emerging, you know, you're there. You are so emergent in the lives of the people who care most about you. You were there. And don't panic, right? Like, it still feels like people are trying to do, or it's as if time is going by at the same speed and intensity as it was before. So like, you have to still get things done on the original schedule. Blow the schedules up, everybody. Blow them up. Nobody knows what's going on and how to deal with it properly. So figure out what you can do for the community around you before we all emerge back out. And then we have to interact with each other. This is the perfect time to stop interacting with people that you don't necessarily know, and keep interacting with your inner circle.
I love it, Drew. Thank you. And I bet everyone's going through their pictures right now. So especially that first picture. So this is from Sydney. Sydney wants to know, Drew, what was your lollipop moment in your life?
Oh, I have so many. Like, every single time somebody sends one of those LinkedIn or Facebook messages, that's a lollipop moment for me. Honestly, I shared the lollipop moment, obviously. Like, that's a really, really big one. But when people share theirs with me, that is like, it creates another one for me. Here's an interesting thought that you may discuss as a class or classes at some point. That original lollipop moment, I was thinking of this the other day, or actually a couple years ago, and it still sticks with me. Somebody wrote me and said, we're having this discussion in our leadership class. You call it the lollipop moment. Which is the lollipop moment? When you gave that young woman the lollipop and therefore made her feel a little more welcome and introduced it, or 4 years later when she came and told you about it. Which one of those is the lollipop moment? Because they said you're not really clear on that in your speech. Which one of those is the lollipop moment? And I started to think all those years ago where I put the speech together, and I honestly do not know which one I intended at the time, which one I intended to be the lollipop moment. And then I did a poll of my friends, and it came out like 8-7. And so if you ever want to talk about an interesting idea, because in the discussion, we had this fascinating discussion of what leadership meant and how we defined it. So if you ever want to have a class discussion on anything, if you've used that video, if you've read the book, which one is the lollipop moment? Is it when I created that moment that made her feel a little safer, or when she came back and told me that it had that impact? Are they both lollipop moments? Which is which? I'm not sure. But every single time someone tells me that work that I've done has impacted them and specifically led to them passing something forward, that's a lollipop moment to me. And there's been so many of them for me.
Excellent.
Someone told me about one in high school, like a year ago, like, and I don't remember it at all. And I'm like, wow.
I love it. Thank you, Drew. Thank you, Sid, for the question. So this is from Devin. And Devin did the online portion of the course. And Devin shared, you mentioned in your course to have a day one moment every day. How do you keep this mindset during this time of social distancing and this new era that we're in right now?
Yeah, I think that sometimes maybe we convince ourselves that this has to change our behavior more than it does. I think it has to change our physical behavior. I also do recognize I'm a straight white guy with a well-paying job, which has given me a lot of reserves. So there's a privilege that my perspective on this, because I can hunker down and know I've got 18 months of I'm okay and I don't have to lay off my people. And not everyone gets that. I do realize that. But really the biggest changes here is that our physical behavior, our mental mindset towards the world doesn't necessarily have to change. But there's so much online, and of course it completely dominates everything that's going on now, that in some ways it's convincing us we need to change more than we actually do as people. We need to change how we physically act, but not necessarily how we think. And I think I also have this, it's such an odd thing to say this as an advantage. My alcoholism has demonstrated to me the power of the non-negotiable day one behavior. So if you're asking me how I do it, it's because I already have to. So I'm repeating something that is already a part of my life. So if your question is how do I do it, right? Not so much Drew, but how do I, asking the question, do it? That to me is the same way that we commit to anything. If you go out, for all the people who are, in sports management, I also guess that you love physical activity. It's that discipline that comes down to it. And there is a moment every morning where you have to ask yourself, do I want to be the person that I want to be? Or am I going to choose to let myself down? And for me, I always put it that way. Am I willing to choose to let myself down here? I reframe, do I want to or do I not want to, with do I want to let myself down or do I not want to let myself down? And that really, really helps. And also accountability is a big one. The number of people I have to deal with during this situation where we're supposed to send a video every day doing whatever it is we've committed to, whether it's 30 seconds of cardio, whether it's 30 seconds of writing, well, not 30 seconds, but 15 minutes of writing, whether it's getting up early and hitting the treadmills together. I've got like 7 people who I have to send a text to or a video to every day. And we are not merciful when we skip it. Like, we're dicks to each other. But one of the great things about friends when you're looking at accountability is you have to give each other permission to annoy each other, because that is what it's all about.
Perfect. All right, Drew, thank you. So the next one is from Michael. In one of the things that we've pushed for all of our students is the idea of everyone can be a leader, should be a leader. You start your leadership today, not waiting till graduation or when you have that fancy title. But what makes a leader great in your eyes?
I think that it's a lot like in the book, Jimmy and Earl, is that I do think what is a great leader depends entirely on the person, right? Like, it's almost as if there's that famous Far Side cartoon where the professor's standing in front of like an elephant and a monkey and a fish and being like, your final exam is climb that tree, and being great is, and the monkey seems very pleased with this. Great as a leader is entirely dependent on your context. And I know that always seems like such a cop-out when you ask someone, oh, what defines a great leader? A great leader to me is defined in consistency. Now, and I try to stay away from the term great, right? Because it is so subjective. And also it is a word that we are so good at convincing ourselves we do not deserve. Like, we can look at what makes a great leader in somebody else, but we just don't give that title to ourselves. So it's easier to evaluate our consistency than it is to evaluate our greatness, right? It is easier to evaluate the consistency of a leader that's out there that we work with every day than it is to evaluate their greatness. And so for me, great leadership, personal leadership, comes from extraordinary consistency. And those are and that's consistency to making decisions with your values, to doing one thing, whatever that thing is, every day. That to me, consistency is a better measuring stick of your effectiveness as a leader than the word greatness, because you can evaluate consistency. It's really hard to objectively evaluate greatness.
Wow. I love that. It's so funny that the term consistency is coming up through this thread of greatness, because it's you mentioned Coach Driscoll from the presentation from 2 years ago when you were down at UNF, and that's someone that you still remember after 2 years, and he's that type of person where he's has that same passion, same energy, every conversation, every meeting, every time he talks to our groups of students. So it's pretty powerful. I love the fact that you mentioned consistency as that constant for those folks who, when you think of greatness, it's not just, one-time thing, greatness in certain situations. It's, can you be great through good times and bad? And that consistency is key.
And I think it's important to remember too, that I don't actually remember anything he said. And that's not an insult, but I do remember that energy. And I mean, what's the
Sure.
famous quote? People don't remember what you did, they remember how you made them feel. And also remember the concept of greatness as the way we really look at it. History is written by the winners, right? And people also tend to evaluate people on very small portions of their life. Like I just read a book that talked about Herbert Hoover, the president, and what do people remember? Like he was president in 1929 when the stock market crashed. Go back and look at the research about what Herbert Hoover did before he was president over the beginning of the darkest period economically in American history. This man is an extraordinary humanitarian. I mean, but then again, you could look and probably people will talk about his exploitative nature as a businessman and a mogul. But he helped save, some people guess, 100 million lives in Belgium during the war, because nobody would feed Belgium, and they were caught between these two warring factions. And that man, as an individual citizen, went in there and saved 100 million lives by paying for the food himself, some people think. Also, that's the guy who standardized sizes. Like you get a quart of milk or you get a gallon of milk. Back in the early part of the century, every company just built a different size. So bear in mind that history is written by a very small number of people, and greatness often in people is determined by an incredibly small number of people who decide to write about or think about or talk about your greatness. And so greatness, take a look at history and realize it's always written by who was left.
I love it. I love it. All right. So many of the questions you've touched upon in terms of now with less social interactions and more communication virtually, different things like that. But here's one question from Samantha. First, thank you so much for being here. Second, what do you believe is the number one thing that people forget to lead by? So for example, when leading in the moment, I think that we can forget our why and how we lead. So do you have any advice on how to hold ourselves accountable?
I think that one of the things that I do is on my walks every day, I try to go 2 or 3 hours. I mean, again, there's some, sorry. 1 second. Oh dear. Okay, that there's some privilege in this comment as well, because people have to go to school, work really hard, but I walk every day. And at least half of that walk, if it's a 2-hour walk, I have to do it without sound, like without music, without an audiobook, even though I love using that talk. And what I do in that time is I try to take a look at my behaviors over the course of the previous day, particularly conflicts that I'd had, or anger that I felt, or sadness that I felt. And I try to imagine that I'm a documentary subject, where I'm being followed around by a narrator or a journalist. And I try to imagine how a third person would evaluate what had just happened. And that allows me, like, holding yourself accountable isn't just in the moment. Holding yourself accountable usually comes afterwards. And I think forgiveness has to be we have to lead with personal forgiveness, but forgiveness needs to be accompanied by a commitment to improve, right? And so for at least an hour, I look back at my life as if it was, I know this is weird, as if it was being narrated by a journalist. I read a book called Bad Blood, Secrets and Lies in a Silicon Valley Startup, about Theranos. And it's obvious that the journalist hates the people involved in this. Now, they sued him and were mean, I get that. But I also started to realize that you're reading one perspective. And I try to imagine an objective journalist looking at my behaviors and my decisions, right? You know, engaging with Buddy this morning, and sort of take a look back and realize that, take away that emotion and be like, okay, you need to be better at this. And then accountability to me isn't dwelling on the way I failed it. It's evaluating whether the next opportunity I have to improve on that behavior I did. And I actually spend an hour a day looking back and imagining. It's actually a psychological way that people, or that, you know, professional psychologists ask people to do to get a different perspective on their life. Write an article on this as if you were a third person objective, especially when it comes to conflict you're having with other people. Step back and how would a third person evaluate this? And that's actually how I keep myself accountable, is I actually take the time every day to look back and ask myself, where did you fail? And how can I do better next time? And as long as you commit to doing better next time, I do think that you're holding yourself accountable. Because what are you holding yourself accountable to? Better behavior. You can't go back and change behavior. You can also only ask what your future behavior is going to be. And sometimes that involves addressing the previous stuff, but mostly it's really rare that we will spend an hour with nothing in our ears because we don't like the voices in our heads. And I've often started to say now that part of the reason that I'm so dedicated to trying to do these 3 to 6 good things a day tied to my values is because for all of us, I think one of the scariest times in our lives is between when we turn off our screen, our television, whatever it is, and put our head on the pillow and when we fall asleep. The gap between putting your head on the pillow with the screens off and falling asleep, all that you have is you. And all that you have is your knowledge of the decisions you made. And most of us really, really hate being alone with those. But I started to realize the world has given us 1,000 opportunities to never have to be alone with those thoughts. We can always put in our headphones. We can always open up our phone. And a lot of people like falling asleep with the TV on or their phone, like falling onto their chest, because it takes away that time, that even if it's only a minute between when you put your head down and when you fall asleep. That's the scariest time for most people. So I stay dedicated because honestly, I don't want to be so scared in that moment anymore.
Wow. That's powerful. That is powerful. Drew, thank you. So next question is from Kayliana. Kayliana asked, how do you maintain balance with any suggestions for college students balancing career, work, school, getting outside, all those different things? How do you find balance?
Well, one, I try not to have balance. No, and I mean, that's weird. I don't mean like I don't try to have a life that makes sense and doesn't allow me to stay healthy. What I mean is balance insinuates equality, right? Like if you look at a scale, it bounces when the things are the same. And I don't think our lives are supposed to have equal slices of the pie. And so for me, it's not about balance, it's about harmony. And the thing about a harmony and the thing about music is that it mixes and matches in different ways, right? For me, work-life balance makes people believe that they have to find a way to balance between the two of them. Where in harmony, if you think about jazz, different notes, different melodies, different instruments can take the lead at different times, and yet it still makes sense. So for me, I don't look for balance. What I try to do is I evaluate the various parts of my life based on how much energy they give or how much energy they take. And what you're trying to do is create a mix in your life where the energy coming in is greater than the energy going out. And so you take a look constantly at the various parts of your life, family, work, school, and recognize that sometimes they give energy and sometimes they take it. Like your friends sometimes are the energy like generators that give you the boost. Sometimes they drain you. And so for me, I'm not trying to bounce things, I'm trying to harmonize them. And that means sometimes I see my friends less because they're draining energy while work is adding it. Sometimes it flips. But the idea of balance is like you got to find a way, like a set, unchangeable sort of bounce between things. And I feel that it's all about harmony. One of the other things I do, though, is, and this, I really resisted this for a long time, is that I actually created a schedule a week at a time. You know how sometimes people will be like, okay, here's my new schedule for the month. Like I'll get up at 5:30 and do this much, and then I'll go and do this. I think I do that on a weekly basis because on Sunday I take the time to evaluate what's the energy balance right now. Work is giving me more energy, so this week here's how I'm going to break it down. And I wish I had like a better, more philosophical way of doing it. But the ultimate way is on a very practical level. On a weekly basis, I evaluate how I'm gaining energy and losing it, and then I actually set up a schedule for the week, and I send it to a friend of mine, and he sends me his, and we sort of keep each other accountable for those specific broken down times, and we're flexible about it on a week-to-week basis, as opposed to saying, here's how it's put. Like I have a friend of mine yesterday who was like, I get up every day at 4:30, and then I do meditation, and people like do that all the time, and then I think, this is my strategy. I get up every day at 4:30. This is my process. I go to the bathroom, and then I have a quick 3.5-hour nap, and then I start to work. So I get up at 4:30 too, and do that. And if it works for you, it works for you. But I schedule things, but I don't make a firm schedule I do it every week on a weekly basis so I can stay flexible and bounce between energy in, energy out, because life balancing isn't the key, harmony is the key. And also, most of the things you're supposed to do can actually survive without you. So don't stress yourself out too much if you have to take a step back.
Excellent. Drew, so I know on your social media, you've been spotlighting some of the books that you are reading, some leadership books. Can you recommend one or two that really stand out beyond your book? Our students are
I would never
already
recommend my book.
Yeah. Well, listen, we have bookstore orders for about the next year and a half. So your book is with us.
I don't think it's good. I just my publisher hates the fact that I never promote it, just because I think it's so tacky in many ways. But yeah, I mean, I'm reading. It's weird they're not leadership books. I think you can find leadership lessons in almost every book. But what I discovered is that Neil Pasricha, who wrote the Book of Awesome, who's a good friend of mine, he was giving a speech in promotion of his new book and commented that he read like 110 books last year. And I was like, I read 4. And that was really embarrassing because I used to read everything. Like when I was a kid, I read absolutely everything. They only let you take out 12 books from the library at a time. So I'd go through 12 in like 4 days, and then I'd read whatever my sister took out. So I read like the first 42 books of the Babysitters Club series. I'm a Stacy guy, by the way. And so I really loved A Whole New Mind by Daniel Pink. If you are a business person and you haven't read it yet, Good to Great is the greatest business book ever written. Find Your Hedgehog. And I really loved A Whole New Mind. I loved Seth Godin, Linchpin, Are You Indispensable? There's one that I think every college student or university student should read called So Good They Can't Ignore You by Cal Newport. For those of you who are going to be working with teams, business teams, sports teams, whatever, the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni was a game changer for me. And then I read everything else by Patrick Lencioni. And the cool thing about Patrick is that all of his books are fables. So they're stories. And then at the end, he reviews it. But he prays, instead of just writing a book about his approach to things, he tells you the story of a fictional character. And I've seen people do that and it'd be super cheesy. But Patrick Lencioni's are excellent. It's like watching a really good episode of television. It's not super cheesy. So those books have really impacted me. I like reading biographies. Honestly, Bad Blood, the story about Theranos, is very, very eye-opening. The problem is what you see in that company, you can see reflected in some broader forms of leadership in the world too. But those are some of the ones that really hit me. A Whole New Mind is really important, I think. And those ones I think are just tremendous. I've really enjoyed those. Oh, you know what's also a cool one? And it's really fun, it's called Mobituaries by Mo Roca. And it's just sort of, he loved obituaries as a kid. And so he feels that some figures in history haven't gotten their due. And so he does like his own obituary of about 10, 12 pages that sort of, so that's how I learned about Herbert Hoover. And he even did it for the station wagon. So he actually goes through society. He did it for the trees at Auburn that were killed after an Alabama-Auburn game. So he actually does these obituaries and gives you some background on the lessons that he learned and how these things change the world. So it's I love that book.
Excellent. I love that, and I love that you have the opportunity to spotlight others and really show that that depth of knowledge that you're gaining through these. And we might have some new choices for some of our classes moving forward. So excellent. So,
yeah, and if anybody reading here, I just saw someone say they've read So Good They Can't Ignore You, which is great because its argument is following your passion is terrible career advice. And I thought it was gutsy of someone to say that, but then he explains why it is. But if anybody out there wants to send Dr. Olson like books that totally changed their life, please tell him so I can review them and send them out to the rest of the world.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, look at this. Learning with and from. That's what I shared on social media today, the idea that we're learning together. So, Drew, for the sake of time, and I know we had a challenge at the start of this, but I do
take the time you need. Keep asking questions.
I do want to honor your time. So we'll take a few more, whichever ones we can't get to, I'll send to you and I'll get feedback from you via email.
I'll do a video for you, man. But you just keep asking questions. I will stay on. Like, people can leave. I know they've got stuff to do, but I'll try to answer all the ones I can until I either am dangerous that I'm going to throw up on this, or I just don't have anything left in my tank. Because,
No.
my man, my time is your time as long as you need it.
Well, I appreciate it, and I know my students and our UNF family appreciate it. So, all right. So, question from Gary. First of all, Mr. Dudley, thank you for sharing your time with us today. Very gracious,
Oh,
Gary.
thank
Thank
you.
you.
Please call me Drew.
We think of leadership as a gracious act. How can we break down leadership into acts we can commit every day to impact someone's life or affect someone's life?
You know, this is one I'm struggling with a lot right now. Is that one of the things that is in, you know how at the top before some people might have come on, oh my God, I need to shave. The idea was elevate, don't escalate. That's one of the things that I would have not taken out of the book, because I said never escalate. And I think that was an inaccurate statement. I think that the desire to be gracious and respectful is important. I also think, and this is one of the next things I'm going to write about, is that it sometimes leads us in attempting to be gracious and respectful and honorable to let bad behavior slide because we don't want to not be gracious. All right. It is the role of leaders sometimes to take a stand when things are unacceptable or unjust. And I think that that involves escalating sometimes. And when I say escalate, I don't mean create a physical confrontation necessarily, but I also think that you can't just stay quiet in the name of not making people upset. I had a discussion the other day with someone, and eventually he just said, agree to disagree, because he was just like, no one has the right to tell me to social distance. This is my life, and you can steer around me. And I was discussing with him, you know, the various, and he's just like, agree to disagree. I'm like, your approach to things could kill people. We're not going to agree to disagree, because agreeing to disagree is a cop-out where the person is basically saying, I don't care. My reality is more important than facts. And therefore, we're just going to agree to disagree. You could agree to disagree on opinions. You could agree to disagree on strategies for solving problems. You don't get to agree to disagree on facts and reality. And we can't let that slide. And so ultimately, I think we should be gracious, and every single, and you know, I get thrown back in my face. Well, you wrote a book about how you have to have a positive impact on everyone every day, and now you're pissing me off. I'm like, no, I wrote a book about having a positive impact on somebody every day. And if living my values means not that I have to make everybody happy, it means that every day I have to go to bed knowing that I can point to specific moments where I live my values. And one of my values isn't making everybody like me. One of my values is impact and growth and courage. And courage sometimes means standing up and saying, we will not agree to disagree on this. I will not agree to disagree on injustice. I will not agree to disagree on someone coming in and being racist. I'm not going to be like, well, that's my opinion. No, it's not your opinion. There's any opinion that dehumanizes other people is not a valid opinion. And this idea that polite leaders respect everyone's opinion. You respect other people. Not every opinion deserves to be respected. And I think that courage and I think that leadership is not always being gracious. It is always recognizing whether or not this thing is worth taking a stand on. And so I think that the questions that I suggest is how you make sure every day that you live your core values. But one of the things I change in my book is that leaders never escalate. There are issues that should be escalated. There are issues that people in power try to push down so they can't be brought to the surface. But there would still be so many horrible things. Like the problem is if I point out any of them, then people on different ends of the political spectrum instantly don't like anything that I say. But anything that dehumanizes other people, say that some other people don't deserve the same rights as others, we should escalate those issues up. Some of those issues we're not even aware of. Trans issues are front and center now, and they were just pushed down for ages. But it was because some people said we are going to escalate this issue to the mainstream so that it can be addressed. But right now, that was the same with gay rights. It was the same with women's rights. It was the same with civil rights. People constantly tried to agree to disagree on this and to shove those things down. And if leaders weren't willing to escalate certain issues and not be gracious to great people, then we would not have had many people's rights brought into the mainstream.
Wow.
So I'm really into that right now.
You're even
Because
getting
for too
applause.
long,
You're getting applause on that one with the Zoom applause. So
well, look, man, for too long, like I was so open about the alcoholism and the bipolar and the weight battles and what happened with Anastasia that sometimes you just feel like there some parts of me I don't want to put out into the world. And I started to realize that, you know, maybe it's dangerous too, because the way, unfortunately, as someone who comes to visit your country, there's many cases now, and you may not be aware of this, where individuals who say anything that disagrees are being stopped at the border, not because they're danger, just because they disagree with the people who have control of the border. And as somebody who, you know, a whole lot of their revenue comes from the United States, there's a fear that comes from posting on Facebook that I disagree with this. And so I kind of said, okay, well, what I'm going to put out into the world is this, and the rest of it I can sit on. And then it gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse. And I realized, man, like what I'm doing sometimes is I'm being Jimmy Fallon, right? Which is just nobody dislikes you. All right. Like they go in the middle, don't take any stands. I'm Aaron Burr, for God's sakes. Talk less, like smile more. And so that's part of where that's come from recently, is that if I'm going to live my values, the problem is it could destroy half my business just because I could never come visit again. And that's happening. And you may not be aware that's happening, but there's a lot of Canadians, there's a lot of English, there's a lot of people from all over the world who aren't being stopped because of, you know, we talk about people being stopped just from where they're from, but because of what they think. And that's going on. And that seems to me to not be what America stands for. But then again, the argument that we're getting is we're not American, so we're not protected by that.
wow. So and like I said, you did get a few. I'm getting used to this Zoom technology with the round of applause and the smiley faces and things like that. So
some people just left.
so last question, and the rest we'll be able to share through you via email. And I know my students want to just keep the conversation and the relationship going. But this last one is from Royce, and I'm going to let Royce have the last question for numerous reasons, just because he's been a great asset to our leadership program. And I'm going to be really nice to him because he's going to be working for an NBA team one day. And Drew, you and I will be able to go see a game on.
May I suggest the Raptors?
Okay, perfect. Royce, did you hear that? So the question from Royce was, what's your drive to keep you going, your drive to continually impacting people? So what keeps you motivated to keep going?
Anastasia.
Wow.
Our lives are a tribute to everybody who's ever loved us, but as long as we live them. The world had taken from them someone who made it a lot better, and that leaves a gap. But one of the things that happens when a gap is left is that the rest of us have the opportunity to step in and fill it. And sometimes we've held positions, some of us, or we've been a part of organizations where there's this really powerful, in a good way sometimes, like this incredibly charismatic, powerful force that drives it. And everyone thinks, my God, what are we going to do when they're gone? Especially at colleges, right? Like every 4 years, like people got to go. And, or for some of us, 5 years, 6 years. I discovered beer when I was 20. And I think that leaves a gap. But what almost always happens is when that gap is left, things flow into it. Sometimes that can be bad. We've seen that in power vacuums politically in the world. But I do think that what drives me every day is I think of her, and I think of what made her proud of me. And it sure as heck wasn't how handsome I was. She was proud of me because I tried to do this every day. And now she's gone, and she was a better person than I was. And so now I have to cover for that. And her sister covers for that, and we cover for that. But we have to step up a little more to fill in the gap of what the world is missing now. And so that's kind of what does it. Yeah. There was a question, man, that like someone put up on the screen that asked about when things started off today. Is it still there? I was interested in what it was. I only saw the beginning part.
There are quite a few.
I'll do a video for you trying to answer them all.
Sure,
I will.
sure. We can copy and paste and send all the questions to you again. And the ones that you addressed, you know, they'll be recorded for all eternity. And then the ones that we didn't get to, maybe a recorded Zoom recorded session that we can share within our course as well. So, folks, first of all, I do want to thank my students and staff for being here today and navigating the initial challenges we had. It's unfortunate, but sometimes, you know, leadership prompts people to emerge as leaders even better because of sometimes stressful situations. So I appreciate everyone navigating that and coming back online. And Drew, you know, going through obviously not feeling phenomenal and navigating the start to a session like that. I appreciate you being there. So just from our family to you, Drew, thank you.
Yeah, but if I just could say this at the end, one of the things as I study history, like I'm reading more and more of these books, is one of the things, as much as it can upset you, like looking back through history can upset you because you see these things happen. I've been reading a lot about Reconstruction recently, and it's so frustrating to watch how our minds took a while to get forward or perspectives. But what it does also do is it reminds you of how much we've gotten through. Like I read about historically, I read about the Civil War, I read about some of the things that happened in Canada, in our history as well. I read about Vietnam, you read about World War I, World War II, the Spanish flu. My dear God, humans are resilient. Like we really, really are. And I know that this is close to us and it's here, but our grandparents made it through being sent to war. Some of our parents' great uncles went to Vietnam. Every generation faces something so epic that while it's going on, people can't see the end. And yet we are so powerfully and extraordinarily resilient. And we can do this. We really can. We've done it. We've beaten back everything. We're here. You faced every challenge you've ever had because you're still here. And maybe you got scars and maybe you're not happy how you dealt with it, but there's not a single moment in your life where you can look back at a challenge and say, I didn't get through it, because you're still here. And rely on that as much as you can. We're a wild bunch.
Wow, Drew, perfect way to close this session out. And once again, thank you. And I love that mindset and that idea of resilience. So Drew,
thanks for everything you're all going to do, my friends. You're next. Thanks for everything.
I appreciate it. Drew, thank you. And thank you for the impact you've had on our students, both now and in the future. So
you're a class act, man. I can't wait for a cigar.
Exactly. Yeah, got to get you back. And also we're going to send you some new UNF swag.
Yes, I love your swag.
Yes, more swag your way. So appreciate it.
Because your mascot is so badass.
Yeah, Osprey swoop, my friend. You even did the swoop last time we were down, so I love it.
Did I? Okay. You're incredible, my friends. Thank you for everything.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate y'all.